Today's topic is global security, and in this topic, I'm going to cover first security during the Cold War. What were the issues of security? What are the concepts of security? What are the trends in security and conflict during the Cold War period, roughly from 1945 to the late 1980s, early 1990s. And then we'll talk about the post-Cold War period. What are the trends in the conflict, war, violence, and security in the post-Cold War period? And in all this, I will, especially in discussing the post-Cold War period, I will address a particular question that since the world order is changing and we see now a decline, if not the outright end of the liberal international order, and we see the decline of what I call the American world order, which is the same in my usage as the liberal order. With the decline and decay of the American world order, are we going to see increased conflict and war in the world? Is the world catching fire, so to speak? And because there is no United States hegemony anymore, the way it was during the Cold War period and until really very recently, does it mean that the world will become a very violent, chaotic, disorderly place? Now, this is a major policy question for today. There are many people, many scholars, pundits, leaders in the West who make the argument that the decline or the end of the liberal order means increased violence and strife and chaos in the world. So we are entering a world of chaos. But to me, that's not self-evident. We need to really analyze the trends that we see today in conflict and violence rather than just simply assume it. Just because the West or the United States is in decline or the world order the United States built is in decline, doesn't necessarily mean that the world is catching fire. So, but in any case, this is a question that ought to be analyzed rather than simply we assume that the world is entering a more violent phase. So to do so, we need to look at what was the Cold War like, and the Cold War period was also, in a sense, the period of the liberal order. And what has been the situation since the end of the Cold War in late 1980s and early 1990s, and where are we heading? Where the world is heading today in terms of conflict and violence and peace? We of course see a lot of evidence of conflicts today. We have terrorism is a major problem today. We have conflicts in South Asia, India, Pakistan, for example. We have everywhere conflicts in the southern Philippines, for example. The separatist movement there with the Islamic extremism at play. We see Middle East in strife, both in Syria but also Iraq. And we also have long-standing simmering conflicts in South China Sea, Korean Peninsula, Taiwan Straits. And of course, among the major powers, we see a worsening of relations at this point between US and China. There's a talk of a trade war and the rise of China causing conflict between China and the United States. People talk about the Thucydides trap, which is a way of, it's a metaphor which harks back to the conflict between Athens and Sparta in ancient Greece, and how the rivalry between those two city-states led to the Peloponnesian War. So Graham Allison of Harvard University has written a book on this. So there are plenty of pessimism around it's not very difficult to find a pessimistic view of world security or global security. But do we also see signs of positive signs of peace and cooperation, conflict resolution? Now, when the Cold War ended in again, the fall of the Berlin Wall, early 1990s, there was a moment of hope that peace was breaking out. In fact, there was a moment of euphoria, especially in the West, that the West has scored a victory over the Soviet bloc, which has collapsed, and liberalism and democracy have triumphed, and the world will become more stable and peaceful. But obviously, that's not what has happened. So that optimism has given way to a sense of pessimism. But are we also going to the other end and becoming too pessimistic? So that's the question that we address today, because this is very important in the context of the evolution of world order that we are discussing in this course. The American world order is ending. What is coming next is not clear, but is this then a time of turmoil, so to speak? So let me start by looking at what was the Cold War like. What was security like during the Cold War? So, first thing is the concept of security here. What was the concept of security that countries adopted, and particularly the Western countries adopted at the onset of the Cold War? Now, as you know, the end of the Second World War led to the victory of the Allied powers, with the United States emerging as the strongest power in the world. The United States, of course, was relatively powerful, partly because other countries, other great powers, were either like Germany lost the war, or Japan and Italy, they were defeated in the war, or they were exhausted by the war. For example, the European great powers like Britain and France, or Russia, the great power of the East, so to speak, they were exhausted. So the United States emerged as actually stronger than before from the Second World War. And then it establishes its own international order with institutions like the United Nations, and also embraces what we call liberal internationalism. Now, some of you may know that the United States historically was not an internationalist country. It was an isolationist country. It, because of its geography and because of its own kind of a belief about its own role in world affairs, the United States did not want to get involved in the affairs of other countries far away from its own neighborhood. It didn't want to get involved in the alliance system and the balance of power politics of Europe, what some people call entangling alliances system. And it didn't want to get involved in the affairs of other nations, partly because in the so-called non-Western world, in Asia, Africa, and Middle East, there are European powers still around. Britain, France, for example, and the world had not decolonized, with the exception of Latin America. That decolonization happened after the Second World War. So before that, the United States was, in a sense, free riding in the sense that the European colonial powers were controlling the world. So the only place the United States had to worry about is its own neighborhood, like Central America and the Caribbean, and more generally Latin America. And many Latin American countries have become independent in the 19th century, and the Caribbean countries, which were not independent yet, they were still under colonial rule. So the United States was kind of isolationist country. But isolationism led to internationalism. A little bit after the First World War, but certainly after the Second World War. During the interwar period also, the United States kind of retreated. It could have been the leader of the world, but or it could have led at least the Western nations. It could have pursued internationalism, but it chose not to. It was able but not willing to provide leadership. Britain, on the other hand, which was the hegemon until then, was willing but less and less able to provide leadership. But this all changes after World War II. The United States is relatively powerful, physically speaking, economically speaking, militarily speaking, but at the same time, it's also willing to assume leadership. And that ideology that underpinned the U.S. willingness to lead the world is called liberal internationalism. Create a liberal order, but with an internationalist outlook. Means not an isolationist policy or approach, but with engagement and leadership. Exercising engagement and leadership to build world order after World War II. And it is the United States then that provided the main framework for security for the post-World War II period. Now, one element of that was the concept of security. This is when the concept of what we call today national security was born. Now, national security, in simple terms, means protecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the state from external military threats. Now, this concept is a very American concept. Security becomes defined as security of the state, but sovereignty and territorial integrity being at the core of that. And those values of sovereignty and territorial integrity has to be protected against external military threats. Now, what this definition tells you that it doesn't really bring in internal problems, domestic problems. What states should guard against under the concept of national security is external, outside, and military threats. Now, this suits the United States pretty well because there was no domestic instability in the United States at that period. And, the United States had achieved a measure of stability, internal stability. Nobody was worrying about domestic secession or a civil war like in the previous century, and also any kind of a revolt against the U.S. government. In the West, generally, while the European countries were weakened, generally also there were ideological conflicts between democracy and communism. But the main issue still was not internal but external. And that external threat was, of course, the Soviet Union. While the US and the Soviet Union were allies against Germany, once the victory was achieved over the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, the US and the Soviet Union fell out. Or the US and its Western European allies, particularly Britain on the one hand, and Soviet Union fell out. So the Cold War started. So what we talk about when we talk about the Cold War is a state of conflict and hostility between the Western Bloc, led by the United States, with NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, serving as the main alliance, against the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union, with its alliance called Warsaw Pact as the organizing framework. It was a Cold War because there was no hot war. It was not a direct confrontation. between the two blocs. The war was cold, but still it was a period of great tension and acute conflict. There was always the fear of war breaking out, even nuclear war breaking out. As the United States gets the nuclear weapons, uses against Japan, the Soviet Union follows and gets its own nuclear weapons. And as the two superpowers become nuclear, the fear of nuclear war is always there. But paradoxically, because of that, the fear of total annihilation, because of the sheer destructive power of nuclear weapons, there was also an abundance of caution in getting to a situation where you may have to use it. The two superpowers will actually get into a hot war as opposed to a cold war. So the war remains cold, but the main threat still is from outside. The United States is in many ways a lucky country geographically. So it is far away from Europe. It's far away from the, we have the United States is not that far away from Soviet territory those days, or Russian territory now, because Alaska's proximity to Siberia and the easternmost part of the Soviet Union. But that's not a theater for any land conflict. The United States is relatively insulated from any land-based threats, unless you think of Canada posing a threat to the United States, and Canada by this time had become an ally of the United States. And Mexico was too weak. So the United States' main concern was the Soviet Union, an external threat, military threat, but coming mainly through in the form of nuclear missiles. For European allies of the US, particularly the NATO countries, the threat was much more direct and proximate. So, because the Warsaw Pact forces was positioned along the NATO forces, along the east-west border in Europe. But still, it was an external threat. But United States develops this, it is a concept of national security develops in the United States, focusing on an outside threat, not on an internal threat. At the same time, while the concept of national security is created, the thinking about international order is also developed along the lines that while the Cold War, which is a bipolar international system, is dangerous, it is still a relatively stable situation. A group of scholars in international relations, we call them Neorealists, because they believe that war and peace in international relations is decided by the structure of the international system, meaning the distribution of power in the international system. So if the world is bipolar, according to this view, it is likely to be more stable. If the world is multipolar, which has more than two great powers, is less likely to be stable. So the argument underpinning this is that if you have two countries, the relationship is easier to predict and it's easier to manage. If you have more than two countries, several countries, there is greater confusion and uncertainty and predictability. And this was backed up by their analysis of historical evidence. So Europe before 1945 was a multipolar system. So we had several great powers, Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and the like. And that created instability and conflict, leading to the First World War and then Second World War. But the hope was, especially after the few years into the Cold War, that with two superpowers, with nuclear weapons, it will be easier to maintain peace and stability, especially in what was called the central strategic balance, which means the military balance, strategic balance between the two superpowers and their allies. So the framework of security analysis that developed after World War II was based on national security, where threats were defined or perceived mainly in terms of outside military threats, not domestic internal threats. And the world was, the international system, at least from one perspective, and the perspective of Neorealism, was seen to be more stable compared to the multipolar system of Europe before 1945. So, as the Cold War proceeded, and we had several crisis situations, the Berlin blockade, the erection of the Berlin Wall, but particularly the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which was a major turning point. When the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles on Cuba, which could hit the United States, the Kennedy administration threatened war to attack and destroy those missiles unless the Cubans and the Soviets removed them. So the world came to the brink of nuclear war. There are other conflicts. I mean, as I said, the Berlin blockade, when the United States helped airlifting supplies to Berlin to support the West German state. There were all kinds of tensions in the Middle East, and of course there was conflict in Korea, and the Korean War, and the Vietnam War was heating up. But there was none of this compared to the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the missiles, nuclear-capable missiles, were placed so close to the United States, and the United States, despite its isolationism of the past, always considered Central America and the Caribbean as its own backyard, and a sphere of influence under the Monroe Doctrine. The doctrine was called Monroe Doctrine, which basically meant that no other great power, outside power, can exercise any kind of control or pose any kind of threat to the United States in Central America and the Caribbean, and there'll be no return of European colonial powers in that area, and the United States had a special role in maintaining peace and stability in that area, including the right to intervene in the affairs of countries in this region, Caribbean and Central America, should they pose any threat to the security of the United States or challenge the interests of the United States. So that Monroe Doctrine also was kind of a logical continuation of the sphere of influence concept as practiced by the United States. And then we have nuclear missiles on Cuba directed at the United States that really touches a very raw nerve in the U.S. And with Kennedy administration giving the Soviet Union an ultimatum to remove the missiles or else it will take military action, the world comes to the brink of nuclear war as never before. But out of this situation, which was resolved when the Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba in return for some American commitment to remove its own missiles from Turkey, which is a NATO member, which was also close to the Soviet Union. There was this deal. But out of this Cuban crisis, missile crisis, came an understanding, even clearer understanding, that under no circumstances should the US and the Soviet Union go to war, because that would mean total annihilation. And this is the time when the Soviet Union and the United States both possessed what is called a second strike capability, meaning both of them were able to survive a first strike, nuclear strike, by the rival superpower and still retaliate with enough force to destroy the enemy many times over. So, the second strike capability, which was achieved through a combination of nuclear capable bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, plus submarine-launched ballistic missiles. When both superpowers achieved that, we had a situation what is called, in strategic jargon, mutual assured destruction, MAD. So that creates caution, because either superpower can survive a first strike from the other superpower and still have enough force to retaliate, to destroy that other superpower many times over. And that's possible because you can keep your missiles under sea in submarines, which cannot be destroyed by a first strike. You can keep them under silos, the intercontinental ballistic missile, which are hardened to survive nuclear attack. You can let the bombers fly at the very early warning of an attack by the other side. So, because you have a credible capacity to have a second strike, so you have to be very careful before you go to war and threaten any kind of military action, because there's always the possibility of such a situation escalating into war, which will be a total annihilation for both sides. And because the two superpowers came to the brink of a conflict over the Cuban missiles, this realization of mutual assured destruction struck deeper into their strategic mindset. And out of that came the realization that they should devise some sort of rules to deal with each other in a crisis situation or even in a peacetime situation. Certain understanding that they should never get this close ever again to the brink of nuclear war. So they created certain rules. They means the United States and the Soviet Union created certain rules to prevent that kind of situation ever arising again. So, for example, do not put missiles so close to the territory of the other superpower. Do not engage the military personnel of the other superpower directly. Meaning the US and the Soviet Union should not let their armed forces or personnel directly engage each other, because that could lead to escalation. They should not place missiles or any sort of forces too close to the border of the other superpower. But it's okay to do that through proxy states, to third countries. So, the United States can engage the Soviet Union either directly, in a conflict, not directly, but through proxy states. The US through Israel, for example, Soviet Union through Egypt. That's okay. But no direct confrontation, no direct contact between the two superpowers in a conflict. But that could lead to escalation. So those are some understandings. Also, crisis management, arms limitation, reducing or controlling the number of nuclear weapons once each side has, and creating a hotline during the crisis, communication hotline, so that you can diffuse a crisis from getting out of hand. All this become part of a understanding. Some of them are implicit, but some of them are in form of formal agreements, like strategic arms limitation talks called SALT, or different types of arms control agreements over the use or deployment of nuclear weapons. So, looking at this, analysts, strategic studies experts, particularly those who are we call Neorealists, and here we will bring in a particular name called Kenneth Walsh. He was an American political scientist who was credited with this idea that bipolar systems are more stable than multipolar systems. But generally, people started to think of the Cold War as a period of stability rather than a period of disorder. And in fact, the Cold War was called a long peace later on. By the 1990s, and when there was a period where there was no real, the feared, the Third World War that some had feared, many had feared, never materialized. People said the Cold War actually is a long peace. The longest period, in one of the longest periods in history where major powers, great powers have not fought a war against each other. So, that was basically the strategic framework of the Cold War. Security. National security and bipolarity being assumed to be more stable than multipolarity was the main strategic framework of the Cold War period. The issue here is that this understanding, this concept of national security, the idea of Cold War as a long peace, was very much a Western-centric concept, self-serving Western concept. Why I say that is because, first of all, the historical evidence that bipolar systems are more stable than multipolar systems came from Europe. So it was Europe before 1945 that was more stable, more unstable. Under multipolarity was more unstable, and it's Europe which became more stable under the Cold War. But what about the rest of the world? What about Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, and Caribbean and other places? They were not really stable. Only Europe was spared conflict. There were tension, but there were cold tension, but no outright conflict because of the nuclear weapons, because of the deterrence situation between the mutual assured destruction and deterrence situation between the two superpowers and their blocs. But the rest of the world are plenty of conflicts. Well, the domestic conflicts, regional conflicts. In fact, many of these conflicts were domestic, which means that the concept of national security, which doesn't pay attention, at least those days, to domestic threats, but focuses on external military attack, doesn't really apply to many of these developing countries, or what we call the third world countries. Now, the third world is a term that was coined after decolonization to denote the countries, newly independent countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, and the like. And after decolonization, these countries found themselves in great difficulty to manage peace and order, but most importantly, they found that the most immediate threats to them are from within the countries, not from outside. Partly because of the artificiality of some of these boundaries that they inherited from colonial powers. Sometimes those boundaries did not coincide with the ethnic composition of the states. So some countries, so-called nation states, had many different ethnic nationalities within them, and sometimes the same ethnic group lived across several sort of nation states. So we have multi-ethnic states where, groups brought together by national liberation movements and by the colonially drawn territorial boundaries, but they had difficulty keeping unity among and peace among those ethnic groups. At the same time, maintaining what is called regime stability was also a problem. So the third world states, basically, the main security problem was twofold. One was keeping the state together and prevent separatist movements from seceding away from the state, from this post-colonial state. And the second problem was maintaining a regime security, because many of the regimes that were ruling over these countries lacked legitimacy. They came into power maybe initially through elections, or they assumed office on the back of the national liberation struggles, but then they found themselves difficult to govern because of a political opposition. And because many states, after an initial period of democracy, become authoritarian. The rulers did not want to give up power. So the process of democracy backslided and disappeared. Countries which are initially democratic, turn into dictatorships, like Pakistan, for example, or Indonesia, or Philippines and the Marcos. They all started with democratic regimes, but then they become authoritarian, which means they don't have unconditional legitimacy. And their main problem was maintaining regime survival, because there is no stable process of peaceful change of regimes. That plus the fact that there were ethnic conflicts, the ethnic composition of the states were often very problematic. The relationship among ethnic groups were problematic. There were separatist, secessionist movements in many of these states. And we can give you examples of southern Thailand, southern Philippines, and India in the northeastern part of India, Nigeria, you can name it. All this means in Indonesia we have, of course, plenty of issues. Later on, they become more even aggravated in Aceh and East Timor, Irian Jaya, or West Papua. Now, all this means that the main problem, security problem of the third world was internal. And it had to do less with state security and more with regime security. So the concept of national security, which is we have a nation state, all it has to do is to protect its territory and sovereignty from external military attack. But what if your main threat is from within? And when your territorial boundaries are indeterminate, when the regimes are not secure, they don't have legitimacy. Plus the fact that many of these countries faced communist insurgency, sometimes backed by the Soviet Union and in Southeast Asia by China, communist China. So you have to worry mostly about your internal problem, not about your external problem or external threats. So the concept of security, therefore, did not really apply to, did not fit the security predicament of the third world countries, of the post-colonial countries. And at the same time, because of that, they suffered from severe conflicts. So this idea of a Cold War being a long peace really was meaningless in the context of the Third World. There are plenty of wars and conflicts. We can talk about India, Pakistan fighting 3 wars, and we can talk about, of course, conflicts like Indonesia, Malaysia confrontasi in the 1960s. You can talk about, you can see examples of these conflicts, even large-scale genocide, when Cambodia in the 1970s, where the Cambodian regime of Pol Pot killed a large chunk of its own people, because in the name of reform and creating a kind of a utopian state. You have large-scale violence and genocide in Indonesia, in Cambodia, in other parts of the world. Throughout Africa, plenty of internal conflicts. So, sometimes these conflicts were aggravated by superpower interventions. The Cold War was a period of rampant superpower intervention. But no part of the world that was free from this. No part of the world was too insignificant for either the US or the Soviet Union, in most cases both, to get involved. So while they could not fight a war with each other, the Cold War in that sense was peaceful in their strategic relationship, bilateral strategic relationship, at what is called the central strategic balance. But regional conflicts were free game. So wherever the Soviet Union intervened, the United States will do so, and vice versa. This is how they competed for global influence, not in Europe, but in the Third World. And those interventions, it was either direct intervention through direct military support for the regimes, their client regimes, or sometimes even outright attack, invasion. And outright invasion didn't happen that much, but it did happen in some cases. Like United States invasion of Grenada and Panama, the Soviet Union's case, of course, Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. But often there were proxy wars. So Soviet Union supporting Vietnam, which intervened in Cambodia in the late 1979 and occupied Cambodia through the 80s till 1989, or for that matter, the US supporting Israel and the Soviet Union supporting the Arabs, the US supporting Pakistan, the Soviet Union supporting India, of course the North Vietnam, South Vietnam, US supporting South Vietnam, and the Soviet Union supporting the North. Now all these things kept happening. And these interventions by the superpowers, which they felt was necessary to maintain their global influence, otherwise the other side will gain an advantage. They aggravated third world conflicts. Even though the conflicts originally started in the third world, they started from domestic regions, but superpower intervention escalated them and could make them regional and international. And because of this, there are plenty of violence, plenty of disorder, plenty of war in the third world. Of course, there are fewer interstate wars, state-to-state war compared to internal or regional conflicts. Conflict that started with internal causes within the state and became kind of regionalized. But either way, many parts of the third world were very unstable. Central America, Nicaragua, El Salvador conflict, in Horn of Africa between Ethiopia and Somalia, and sometimes the Cubans get involved. Cuba being an ally of the Soviet Union, Cubans intervene in Angola to support the regime there, and the United States will counter-intervene and support the enemies of the regime. So the classic case was in Cambodia when the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia and ousted the Pol Pot regime in 1979. The United States and the Western countries supported the ousted regime plus other Cambodian factions to fight back with against the Soviet-installed regime. Afghanistan is another example. Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979, and the United States backs the resistance, the Mujahideen, through Pakistan, provides direct help, including Stinger missiles that can shoot down Soviet helicopters. This pattern repeats itself throughout the world, and the third world becomes very violent and unstable. So the main point is that the Cold War was a period of relative peace in Europe and in the central strategic balance. But it was a period of conflict and violence and disorder in the third world. It was not a long peace for the third world. It was actually a place of a lot of hot conflicts and genocide, sometimes originating from internal causes, but aggravated by superpower intervention. And there were also some colonial wars, like in the Algerian War of Independence, which was very violent, and South Africa, the resistance of African National Congress against the apartheid regime, which was backed by Western countries, including UK and also the United States. So, the point is that the security of the world in the Cold War was different, had a different meaning. The concept of security during the Cold War had a different meaning from the West than for the Third World. While the Western concept of security was national protection of sovereignty and territorial integrity against external threats, like for the US Soviet attack, as for the Soviet Union and American and NATO attack. For the Third World, the main problem of security was internal or domestic, and it often involved regime security rather than security or loss of sovereignty per se. Sometimes proxy wars were encouraged by the fact that there were safety valves. US and the Soviet Union can compete in the third world without risking a nuclear war. And sometimes probably it was thought that it would be better to do that way because there is going to be a lot of tension in the Cold War since you cannot really directly attack each other. So you can let off the steam in your tension, in your competition in the third world without risking nuclear confrontation. So what happens after the Cold War ends? Well, there is a moment of hope and optimism when the Cold War ended, with the collapse of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in 1990, Iraq under Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, and the United States takes the lead with a mandate from the United Nations to get Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. And that creates also a lot of euphoria and hope, because it means that the United Nations for once is working. The Security Council has a consensus. For most of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union did not agree with each other on what is a conflict and how to use the principle of collective security. They could not agree on who was aggressor, who was the victim. So every time there was a resolution, depending on the situation, either of the superpowers would veto it because they had the veto power. So the United Nations was dysfunctional in terms of collective security function. But after in the case of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the collective security principle worked. The United States took the lead, but many other countries contributed. So that created also hope that we are seeing a new world order. The senior George Bush, who was the president at that time, called it a new world order. And that's also the time of the U.S. victory over Saddam Hussein, 1991, the talk of a unipolar moment began. Now, an American journalist called Charles Krauthammer, he coined the term, he called it unipolar moment. So the Cold War bipolarity has ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Instead of going into multipolarity, we now have a unipolar moment because there is not really any other great power that can challenge the United States. A multipolarity, the concept of multipolarity assumes sort of a certain amount of equality in power among a bunch of major players. But the United States was really so dominant after the end of the Cold War that it's meaningless to talk about multipolarity as if other countries really can come anywhere to match or challenge the United States militarily. So the idea of unipolar moment, bipolarity goes to unipolarity rather than multipolarity. That becomes vogue after the US-led force or coalition ousts Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. And this talk of unipolarity also fuels the talk of the liberal hegemonic order. Now, the concept of liberal order was there on the background, but after the end of the Cold War, it becomes more prominent. That the world is not only unipolar, but it's also liberal, with the United States at the helm. So, the United States, everything it has done since the Second World War becomes part of this liberal hegemony or liberal hegemonic order. The United States organizes the world and leads the world on the basis of post-war institutions like the United Nations, IMF, World Bank, and while some of its designs are frustrated by the Soviet Union during the Cold War, now there's no Soviet Union. So the liberal order becomes a liberal hegemonic order. And with in China and India beginning their economic reforms, meaning they are turning liberal. Before there was, China, of course, had a centrally planned economy, communist economy, And so did India. Even though India was not a communist country, it had a very socialist economy, state-controlled economy. When they undertake reform, the results, therefore, the sense that the liberal order is becoming really global and hegemonic. Every country, including China and India, are buying into it. And a scholar called John Eikenberry made this concept very popular with his book, First After Victory, but his book in 2010 called 2011, Liberal Leviathan. It assumed that this post-war order that we have is a liberal world order, and that order has become global. It has provided collective goods. It has benefited everyone, including potential challenges like China and India. Now, all this is happening, but in reality, the situation was not so rosy. So, the hope for stability and order was created by the defeat of Saddam Hussein, soon was followed by rise of ethnic conflicts. So we had conflicts in Great Lakes, Rwanda, Burundi, in Africa, Central Africa. We had severe conflict in the Balkans, Yugoslavia conflict, the breakup of Yugoslavia, and the conflicts between Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia. Both these situations involve genocide, and we have also ethnic conflicts breaking out in other parts of the world. Then we have the 9/11 attacks, the Al-Qaeda-led attacks, terrorist attacks in the World Trade Center. That creates another sense of a wave of insecurity. And at the same time, while all this was happening, a new category, relatively new, because they were always around, but there was greater attention paid to them after the end of the Cold War, we call non-traditional security threats. They're related to problems of primary climate change, drug trafficking, people smuggling, and also financial turmoil. These are non-traditional in the sense that they're not military, they're non-military, but they can cause a lot of conflict, and they can affect the lives of people, cause a lot of misery, and sometimes even conflict. So studies came up to show that climate change, if not addressed, could lead to migration, flow of refugees, which then creates ethnic conflict. Because, for example, when people lose their habitats because of, say, overcultivation or drought, which are effects of climate change, they migrate to another country, and the local people of that country do not like the new migrants, so you have ethnic conflicts. So some people would argue that that's what happened in Bangladesh, in the case of Bangladesh, relative to the Myanmar, for example, the Rohingyas, for example, which have been much in the news. But also people thought, some analysts have said that this is the situation also in Somalia, Ethiopia, Horn of Africa. A lot of the conflicts there were caused by movement of people because of climate change and depletion of resources. So those non-traditional threats were also linked to globalization. Sometimes those threats or those conflicts, those challenges, there may not have been security problems to start with, but they were securitized, meaning that governments wanted to call them security threats so that they can draw or mobilize more attention and devote more resources and deploy the military into fighting, into addressing them. It gives the military an upper hand vis-a-vis the civilians in the domestic political process. So that's called securitization. When a particular non-traditional threat like climate change or refugees or migration is considered to be a national security problem. And therefore, you have things like war on drugs. You have war on terror, global war on terror. Now, this gives a security framing to, in some cases like drugs or climate change, to non-military phenomena. Terrorism is kind of different because it is, in a sense, involves direct violence by a group against a state or people for political reasons. But things like climate change, things like drug trafficking, people smuggling, migration, refugees in particular, people fleeing humanitarian, people fleeing conflict zones, while you should treat them as a humanitarian issue, but treating them as a security issue allows the government to get more attention, resources, and mobilize its people. And that's called securitization. And because of that, the concept of security expanded. It was no longer just about military threats. It was also about non-military threats. And this happens both in the Third World and the West. And this change in the West is more important because before the end of the Cold War, the West never paid attention to these non-traditional security threats or did not see them as security threats. In the Third World, there was always a sense that these non-military problems are important security challenges. But now, the West and the rest come together in kind of a shared, broader understanding of security. That security is more than just protecting your sovereignty and territorial integrity from external military attack. Security also involves this what is called transnational challenges, which are linked to globalization, because globalization aggravates, it acts as a transmission belt for these threats. For example, pandemic, the SARS crisis, severe acute respiratory syndrome crisis of 2002, it became a global phenomenon, at least a transnational phenomenon, because of tourism and travel. Increased tourism and travel, expands the scope of a threat or a disease like SARS, or for that matter, a financial crisis, which can start from one country but spreads, like what happened in 1997. The financial crisis, what is called the Asian financial crisis, starts in Thailand with the collapse of the Thai baht. But global finance is so mobile these days because of globalization. Finance is so mobile because of internet, because you can transfer money at the stroke of a computer key, that it spread very quickly and affected Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Korea, and the like. Whole Asia was affected. So, transnational problems are linked to globalization. So, therefore, we are beginning to see the origins of this notion of global security. From national security, we move into global security. Security is increasingly global. And security threats know no boundaries. Climate change is another example. Climate change, like whether it's air pollution or global warming, no matter who is to blame, who is responsible most for it, it affects everybody, particularly global warming. And that creates this paradigm of global security. So you see the concept of security changing from national security to global security, from military threats to non-military or non-traditional threats. And another shift is from state security to human security. We talked about national security. National security is basically security of states. In the Third World, it was security for states and regimes. It was never really security for the people. But in the 1990s, a new concept emerges called human security, which looks at security for the people, the basic unit of the state, or the focus of protection is not the state or the government, but the people themselves. And people security can be affected by freedom. People security, to ensure the security of the people, you need to ensure security of freedom from fear and freedom from want. Now, freedom from fear means when you have conflicts, intervention, whether there are internal or external conflicts, but a lot of the conflict those days were internal conflicts, ethnic conflicts. So protecting people from ethnic conflict, from the danger posed by conflict and violence, is freedom from fear. Freedom from want is ensuring that people are well fed, well housed, they don't suffer from poverty, malnutrition, or lack of education or poor health. So, human security therefore added a new dimension. While we have shifted from national security to non-traditional security before, this time the shift was from the state to the people. So the concept of security becomes expanded, and you'll also increasingly find that there are a category of threats under this rubric of global security. Some of these non-traditional threats linked to globalization. They actually don't respect not only national boundaries but regional boundaries, or the so-called divide between the East and the West. During the Cold War, the West was relatively secure. It didn't have to worry about domestic violence. It didn't have to worry about, it had to worry about attack from the other bloc, the Soviet Union. But that was really managed through nuclear deterrence. Only in the Third World that conflicts happened. The Third World was associated with conflict and violence. But after 9/11, nobody was secure. The threat of terrorism affected both the rest and the West, including the United States, because that was the single largest loss of American lives from an attack since Pearl Harbor. So the threat of conflicts becomes real and immediate to the West. Things like migration, illegal migration, drug trafficking. Now, again, because they were securitized, they become common to both the West or the North and the South, the so-called Third World and the Western world. So we have seen a globalization of security, and because of this climate change is another example, by the way, which doesn't spare anybody. So it affects the Western countries as much as it affects non-Western countries, although it can affect some of the non-Western countries more. We call it global South. After the Cold War, the term Third World became less usable or used, and the term global South took over, but I am using them interchangeably. So we see expansion of security, but it also tells you that the liberal order was not really all that peaceful, was not free from conflict. So now there's a tendency to think of the liberal order very nostalgically and say it was really maintained peace and stability, and if it is gone, we will see a lot of conflict. But my argument is that the liberal order was always full of conflict, both during the Cold War and after the Cold War. In the last few years, the past decade, also we see what is called the return of geopolitics. Now, what it really means is that the initial hope for a great power peace have been dashed. The rise of China and the return of Russia has created new fears in the West that we're getting back to the kind of geopolitical rivalries that existed in Europe before 1945, and now this is becoming global. Now, remember, after the end of the Cold War, Soviet Union collapses, Russia is weakened, and Russia-US relations are pretty good until the advent of Vladimir Putin. Russia was not an issue for the United States. China also was not much of an issue because China was just through its reforms and was not, the reforms had started, since Deng Xiaoping, but China was not nowhere what it is today. It means it has not become a major security and economic concern to the United States. China was still a growing economy and still a developing economy. But now in the past decade, China has grown and further and has also become quite assertive, geopolitically speaking, in its behavior towards its neighbors. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that China has a lot of power, economic power, but increasingly military power. China had both double-digit economic growth and double-digit increase in military spending. So it is a significantly more powerful country today than it was in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. Russia was weakened by the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, but under Vladimir Putin become much more assertive and nationalistic. And even though economically Russia is not doing all that great, but when the oil prices were high, Russia could also flex its muscles because Russia has a lot of oil. But the rise of China and the return of Russia has created the sense in the West of return of geopolitics. That we are back to the post-Cold War euphoria or a hope for a peaceful world, especially peace among the great powers, is gone, and we are back into this traditional patterns of great power rivalry. So these all create the fear that the world is entering into a very dangerous phase. Some people call it a world on fire. A lot of fires happening in the world, and the world is a mess. So you have to look at it carefully. Is the world really on fire? If so, why? Who is causing those fires? Can we assume that the end of the American world order or the liberal international order will lead to greater violence? So here, I think we have both good news and bad news. Let me talk about who started these fires. Could these conflicts, some of these conflicts which have caused so much aggravation and loss of life, been prevented? Are they natural or by design? Are they acts of choice or results of bad choices made by Western countries, including the United States, or they were inevitable? Well, if you look at some of these conflicts, like the U.S. invasion of Iraq under George W. Bush in 2003, that was entirely avoidable. It was not a war of necessity, it's a war of choice. Because there was no conclusive proof that Saddam Hussein of Iraq had either nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. So, but that war in Iraq caused so much turmoil and instability, total collapse of Iraq. So many people died, and further tension and instability from which Iraq has not recovered quite yet. Similarly, choices made in Libya in 2011 when the United Nations gave a mandate to the Western countries, but generally it is a mandate for going in and intervening to protect the people of Libya because of the unraveling of the regime of Colonel Gaddafi. But that mandate was to protect the people. But what happened is that Britain and France, which laid the Western force there, turned it into a regime change operation. Instead of a humanitarian operation, they turned into a political operation. And that led to the ouster and killing of Gaddafi and total chaos in Libya. So you can talk a little bit about Syria. Syria is a different case, but here is the lack of timely intervention that caused the massive loss of life. The Obama administration decided not to get into Syria after the lessons of Iraq. And as a result, no significant international intervention happened until Russia did so a few years ago. And a lot of people died in Syria. And you can also talk about how the Syrian conflict started, whether it was stoked by the Arab. It was, of course, a part of the Arab Spring, but it was also stoked by kind of an hostility shown towards the Assad regime by the West, even before it was guilty of committing genocide or using chemical weapons. So one lesson is that some of the conflicts we see today could have been prevented. They're not inevitable. Keep that in mind. Then there is the trend that actually a lot of conflicts have ended, and there's been a drop in armed conflicts. According to one estimate by the Human Security Report, there was a 40% drop in armed conflicts between 1991 and 2010. A armed conflict defined as having two parties, one of which is a state and or government of a state, resulting in at least 25 battle-related deaths. There's actually a 40% drop. There was a 40% drop in conflict between 1991, just after the end of the Cold War, and 2010. Now, those conflicts, the trend has been reversed. So the number of conflicts are rising, but not to the extent to match the conflict in the Cold War. Not quite there yet. Another thing is that there are very few interstate conflicts today, like India, Pakistan. Very few. Interstate conflicts almost disappeared. Most conflicts today are internal conflicts. Terrorism is a big concern. And for the United States, it is the number one security concern. Global war on terror. Now maybe China and Russia are coming in as major, replacing terrorism. But for much of the post 9/11 period, terrorism has been the top security concern of the U.S. Now, here's very interesting. The kind of terrorism the United States is afraid of is not practiced by the state, although there is always accusation of state-sponsored terrorism against countries like Iraq or Syria or Iran. But really, terrorism is a threat posed by a network, a non-state actor, not a state. And that's very difficult for a non-state actor to overturn a global or international order by itself. And at the same time, you have to see that terrorism is localized. It's not really, well, the United States calls it a global war on terror, but terrorism itself is localized. So in 2015, only 5 countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Syria, accounted for 72% of all deaths from terrorism. 5 countries. And 2 of them are Syria and Iraq. As I told you, those situations there could have been prevented. Only 4 groups were responsible for 74% of those deaths from terrorism. ISIL or ISIS, Boko Haram, Nigeria, Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and Al-Qaeda, which carried out the 9/11 attacks. So that tells you that it's not really, something that will destroy the world order completely, or global peace and stability. It is localized in Middle East, Africa, Southern Asia, a little bit of Southeast Asia, and to the extent it is localized, it's kind of paradoxically, it's a threat. I don't want to minimize the threat of terrorism, but it's also not something that should cause alarm or too much concern about the end of global stability. and peace. Nuclear proliferation is another threat, which we have now many more nuclear power than in the Cold War. So India, Pakistan, North Korea, and some people think Iran. Now, but nuclear proliferation happened also under bipolar systems, and Indian nuclear program really started during the Cold War, although the tests were carried out after the end of the Cold War. But it really already happened before, and you cannot say that this is just because of the end of the Cold War or just because of the end of the liberal order. Actually, a lot of the nuclear proliferation happens because of the discriminatory nature of the nuclear non-proliferation regimes, which divides countries into nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots. And under the NPT, there is an obligation for the nuclear powers to denuclearize, to dismantle the nuclear arsenal. But they never have bothered to do so. In fact, the nuclear powers have increased their nuclear arsenal. So they have violated at least one part of the NPT. So those countries which do not have nuclear weapons would like to have it. They look at it and say, well, why should only 5 countries have nuclear status, and why shouldn't other countries have? Nuclear weapons bring prestige. Also, there may be a guarantee for regime security. So now, with the North Korean situation, this issue has received a lot of attention. Libya gave up its nuclear weapons, and then what happened to Gaddafi? He was not only ousted but killed. So if you are sitting in North Korea, if you are Kim Jong-un, you want to have nuclear weapons because you don't want to make the mistake Gaddafi made. Nuclear weapons gives him regime security. And that is another reason why some countries aspire to have nuclear weapons. And North Korea's case is very, very clear. So that means that if you have a really credible nuclear non-proliferation regime where both the nuclear countries and nuclear countries carry out their obligation to disarm or reduce their nuclear arsenal, and also you have security guarantees given to non-nuclear states so that they would be discouraged from having nuclear weapons. If we had that kind of a situation, if the non-proliferation regime really worked, I think we may have less chances of nuclear proliferation. So it's a fault of the regime, nuclear non-proliferation regime. Although the Western scholars Western pundits and leaders will never accept that. They will admit that they have not denuclearized, but they will never think that's a region. They will blame it on North Korea, they will blame it on India, they will blame it on Pakistan and Iran. And think of that these countries are violating the non-proliferation regime, and they will never admit that they themselves are also violating what is a very unfair regime to start with, but they are also violating the terms of their own obligations under the regime to reduce their nuclear arsenals. Finally, we are having nuclear peace agreements. We have a lot of peace agreements since the end of the Cold War. Cambodia conflict was settled, Aceh conflict was settled. North Korea, who knows? It might or might not. Chances are probably we will not have peace so soon, but South Korea and North Korea, forget about Trump and the United States. South Korea and North Korea are showing signs of coming to some sort of an understanding. And many of the Cold War conflicts ended with peace agreements since early 1990s. So we have new conflicts, we also have old conflicts settling down. It's not just one-way street, one thing and not the other. So therefore, if you address the question, does the decline of the US and the liberal order mean more conflict? Is the world catching fire? I guess one has to conclude that not necessarily. The evidence is not conclusive that the world is becoming more and more dangerous. There is both good and bad news, And one should not simply assume that just because the American world order is declining and ending, the whole world has become chaotic and violent. Some of the trends we see today, including some of the positive trends, are the result of long-term factors, not just short-term factors. For example, economic development is a big factor behind stability. East Asia has had pretty relative stability. The last really East Asian war was fought briefly between China and Vietnam in 1979, partly because East Asia is far more prosperous. When a country becomes more prosperous or has economic growth and development, there is less chance of popular dissatisfaction and conflict. So economic growth is a big factor. In some countries, democratization helps. In Indonesia, democratic transition led to the resolution of the Aceh problem. Now, the United Nations plays a role and in maintaining peace and stability. And the United Nations have become much more active in peacekeeping and peace building since the end of the Cold War. So some of these have to do with the liberal order. To the extent that we can say the UN is a product of the liberal order, economic growth and development is basically a product of economic liberalization, so hence connected to the liberal order. You can say that democratization is part of liberal order. So you can give some credit to the liberal order for creating peace and stability. But at the same time, you should not also overstate the importance of the liberal order led by the United States in creating conditions for peace. Some of them had nothing to do with the liberal order. Nuclear weapons is not a liberal concept. It's very realist. And also, the United Nations, regional organizations like ASEAN has really helped to keep peace in Southeast Asia. The United States is not really a member of ASEAN or was not behind the creation of ASEAN, although it's engaged in ASEAN and supports ASEAN, but you should give the credit to ASEAN. And which is not a part of the liberal order, by the way. ASEAN countries include a lot of illiberal regimes from the beginning and continue to do so. And there are also other factors. If the UN peacekeeping is responsible for the liberal for peace, who are the biggest providers of peacekeepers to the UN? There's countries like India, countries like Bangladesh, increasingly China. China is the largest contributor of peacekeeping troops to UN from the P5, permanent 5 members of the Security Council. The Western countries do not contribute peacekeeping troops. So here we have to say that to the extent we associate some of the liberal characteristics of the liberal order, the UN was created when the United States created the liberal order. But the management of our UN is not only by the Western countries of the US. Non-Western countries have provided a lot of support and played a role in managing the the UN's contribution to peace and stability. So you should broaden the credit or the agency to include both the Western countries and the non-Western countries, rather than sort of give all the credit to the liberal order. I said, because the liberal order to that extent was created by the United States, supported by the West, and everything really depends, all the reasons for peace and stability depends on the liberal order. So I think we should, therefore, two things here. One is to think of the global security today as the function of multiple actors, multiple sources, rather than just a byproduct of the liberal order. And we should also look at both the positive and the negative side of the picture relating to global stability. That the end of the Cold War, end of the liberal order doesn't necessarily mean chaos and instability, because there are some very positive indications which are long-term factors behind global security and stability. So let me stop here and